Zimmerman was a little different than most sociologists. Most sociologists either look at Christianity and pretend like it had nothing to do with Western civilization for 2,000 years, or it had everything bad to do with Western civilization for 2,000 years. Carl Zimmerman wasn't a Christian, he was just an honest guy. He points out in his book much of the good that Christianity brought to Western civilization. And when he wrote his work in 1947, he predicted in 1947 that America would soon see divorce for any reason or no reason at all. No-fault divorce, which came in the late 60s, early 70s. He also said that we would soon see legalized abortion and that we would soon see rampant homosexuality within our culture. He said that in 1947. Many people dismissed him as crazy. He based it upon his studies of the Greek and Roman civilizations, and he also based it upon his studies in the French and Bolshevik revolutions, amongst other cultures and societies. Well, it was interesting when you read Family and Civilization, but by the way, I couldn't put the book down. He found that the tipping point when civilizations begin their decline, he said, is when people no longer want to have children. And he said, what I mean by that is that they don't want zero, although there's plenty of those, but they only want one or two. And he pointed out how the Greeks, from the time they didn't want to have children to the time they fell to the Romans, was 150 years. From the time the Romans didn't want to have children to they finally collapsed the Germanic hordes was nearly 400 years. America's been in a steep decline for over 150 years now in the number of children they have. In the last 2 years, we aren't even replacing ourselves. 2 years ago, it was 2.01. According to demographers, you need 2.1 just to replace yourselves. And this last year, 2014, it was 1.88. And of course, all of Western Europe is committing familial suicide while we sit here tonight. He said this, Zimmerman said, the reason that's the tipping point for the decline of civilizations is people not wanting to have children is because when men want to be husbands and fathers and women want to be wives and mothers, it produces within people virtue. But when men don't want to be husbands and fathers and women don't want to be wives and mothers, it produces within people vice. So we have a government now that is completely at war with everything about Christianity. Anything that God says in His Word, we seem to have a government now that wants to do exactly the opposite. You know, God gives very stringent reasons for divorce. They say it's divorce for any reason, no reason at all. Nobody gets prosecuted for adultery. That cheapens marriage, cheapens a family. God says marriage between a man and a woman. Well, now they've even gone to this extent where it's now between a man and a man or a woman and a woman. Anything God says in His Word, it's like they want to do exactly the opposite through law within this country. And really, when you study the laws that have been coming down for the last 50 plus years, and Zimmerman actually goes back to the 1800s, he had written off America in 1947 because of the law changes that had already taken place and the mores within the culture. And when you look at all these laws, you see that we have a government that wants to undermine the family, that wants to weaken the family. And the reason for that is that every good statist knows that in order to strengthen the state, you have to weaken the family. And so it's more incumbent upon you than ever to personally take it upon yourself to make sure your homes are strong, to stay in good relationship with your spouse and your children, and to make sure that things are done well there and not to let them go awry. Okay? So I just wanted to give you that exhortation regarding that matter. By the way, how many of you have read Libido Dominandi? Okay. This wasn't written a long time ago. This was written about 15 years ago. E. Michael Jones wrote this book, Sexual Liberation and Political Control is the subtitle. In there he documents and shows how since the French Revolution, governments have shown an interest, a desire, a propensity to legislate licentiousness, sexual licentiousness through law. And the reason they want to is because they found that a more sexually licentious people makes for a more easily controlled people politically. It is a phenomenal work. You don't have to read the whole thing. It's about that thick, going through extensive history, well documented. Just read the first 120 pages. Everything else there is just reoccurring, just the time era changes, okay? Phenomenal work. Here's what Plato said to Dionysius, the tyrant, when he saw him walking on the streets of Sicily surrounded by his many guards. He said, "What harm have you done that you should need so many guards?" And if you go to Washington, D.C. today, you'll notice they've made the place into a virtual fortress. When you went there when you were a little kid, it was like a friendly, nice little town. Now it's a literal fortress. And I don't think it's just because they're concerned about foreign invaders as much as they may be concerned about the people they've been trampling upon in this nation all these decades. I want to talk to you a little bit about the application of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate and then explain the doctrine to you. But I want to talk about the application first just to whet your appetite and get you into it. And I want to talk specifically about the slaughter of the preborn to whet your appetite, because they need application of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. They are being slaughtered, brutally butchered and killed. So I begin my little talk on that by saying for decades now, pro-life groups have nibbled around the edges of abortion. They spend huge amounts of money and people volunteer huge amounts of time only to have a federal court trample their nibblings. Correct? Yeah. Then the whole process starts again with the same outcome once again. Many have wearied and left the field of battle because of it. I've been involved in this fight for decades. I've seen countless people get involved in this fight and leave precisely because of what I'm talking about here. They put in tremendous amounts of money, time, and effort for some little incremental nibbling at this slaughter, only once it's done to have it trampled by a federal court. Goes on over and over again. A recent Bloomberg News article entitled "New Abortion Restrictions in States Are 0 for 8 in Courts" encapsulates what has been the standard operating procedure regarding pro-life legislation for decades. State legislatures pass a law designed to curtail or regulate the murder of the preborn, nibble at it. And then federal courts or the Supreme Court strike the law down in order to uphold their unjust and immoral 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling. And the process goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And it's like, why do people keep looking for a federal solution when the federal government is the problem? They're the ones who impose this wickedness through the Roe v. Wade opinion, and they've upheld it ever since. And yet we continue to go back and beg them to do what's needed and right. Everybody sits by and waits for the next presidential candidate to get elected in order so that we can see Supreme Court justices appointed who will undo Roe v. Wade. Well, let's take that point just right there. In 1973, when Roe v. Wade was ruled upon by the Supreme Court, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were GOP appointed. Okay? For the next 40 years after that, with the GOP telling us every 4 years, you got to vote for our candidate, because if the Democrats win, they'll get to appoint the Supreme Court justices and we'll never undo Roe v. Wade. For the next 40 years after that, the GOP appointed Supreme Court justices were either 7-2 or 8-1 for 40 years. And the slaughter still continues. It's like getting played over and over and over again. The Christians, the pro-lifers. It's like Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown. The GOP's Lucy, we're Charlie. And we're convinced they yell us, "Oh, this time we will do it." And then run up, football's pulled away once again. Consider the cozy arrangement the pro-life groups and the Republicans have created for each other. The pro-life groups offer legislation which nibbles at the edge of abortion. This assures their continued existence as yet another measure will have to be introduced and fought over the following year and the year after that. I've watched this forever. The Republicans, who like to pay lip service to the preborn and see value in having them used as political footballs, are more than happy to accommodate the worthless legislation proposed by the pro-life groups because this gets them votes. This is the cozy relationship we have between the pro-life, pro-family groups and the GOP in this country. They both have, for their own reasons, a vested interest in seeing this slaughter continue. The pro-life, pro-family groups make bundles of money off the bloody backs of the murdered preborn, and the GOP garners many votes off the bloody backs of the murdered preborn. The latest being the whole Planned Parenthood selling body parts. Let's make laws to take care of that, or defund Planned Parenthood. Why don't we just cut off the supply of the body parts by ending this killing in our nation? And that's what the doctrine of the lesser magistrate does, as we'll go on and see. First, we need to understand that there is no federal solution to the slaughter of the preborn. The federal government is the problem. They use raw judicial power to impose it upon our nation. They've upheld this evil through raw judicial power ever since. Second, state legislators and governors need to be prodded to end their cozy relationship with pro-life organizations who seem more interested in prolonging their existence and filling their coffers off the bloody backs of the murdered preborn than they are abolishing this killing. Many of them actually have pension plans for their employees, these pro-life, pro-family groups.
Some of them don't.
Some don't. The one I head up doesn't. Excellent. Third, state legislators and governors need to know that we have their backs if they do what is needed and necessary and protect the preborn. We need to assure them that we will give of our substance and our very lives to support them, doing whatever is needed both publicly and privately to support them for making a stand. Fourth, we need to demand that our state legislators and governors give total interposition for the preborn, total abolition of abortion. This is extremely important. You know what happens if you give a politician less than what is needed and necessary to do? He'll take it every single time. There has to be a demand from the people of nothing less than interposition on behalf of these preborn babies. If anything is given less than that, they'll take it every single time, and that's what they've been doing for 40 plus years now. Fifth, we must offer nothing less to our state legislators and governors than total abolition. Why? Because if we continue to offer these nibble abortion our state officials will take, we will never see the preborn protected until we demand that they are protected. We've been taught that it's wise, and I've listened to this for 30-some years, how Roe v. Wade is the law of the land, which is a lie, and how we have to be wise and take what we can get. We have to be wise and take what we can get. Therefore, we can feel weird about standing strong and resisting lesser actions than total abolition. We can only act differently than we have in the past if we look at the reality of what has been done and realize if we continue to take what we can get, the preborn will continue to be slaughtered as the same cycles repeat themselves for another 40 years. We'll be sitting here 40 years from now in the same position that we're in now. And that's where the doctrine of the lesser magistrates come in. The doctrine is simply that when the higher-ranking civil authority makes unjust or immoral laws, policies, or court opinions, the lower or lesser-ranking civil authority has both the right and the duty not to obey the higher authority, and if necessary, to actively resist the higher authority. This is a quote from Emperor Trajan, who was a higher magistrate, but he succincted the doctrine when he was giving a sword to one of his subordinates. He said this, "Use this sword against my enemies if I give righteous commands, but if I give unrighteous commands, use it against me." That's the doctrine in a nutshell. We call it a doctrine because it was first formalized as a doctrine by Christian men in 1550 in Magdeburg, Germany. This is the first time this confession, the Magdeburg Confession, is available in English. We published it 3 years ago. It's now available out on the table out there. It was the first time the doctrine of the lesser magistrates was formalized, even though the doctrine had been practiced by men in the Old Testament and even non-Hebrew, non-Christian nations. John Knox wrote his appellation to the nobles of Scotland, the nobles being the lesser magistrates of their day. It's probably the best treatise on the doctrine of the lesser magistrates ever written. He cited over 70 passages of Scripture in his treatise. The doctrine can need application in any form of government, whether a democracy or a dictatorship, whether a monarchy or a representative constitutional republic. Why? Because tyranny can raise its ugly head in any form of government constructed by man. Okay? This is a story about Emperor Caligula. If you know anything about him, tyranny personified. In 39 AD, he got ticked off at the Jews about something, so he ordered the governor of Palestine, Governor Publius Petronius, to make a statue of himself. He actually passed a law of the emperor, and the governor was to make the statue and place it in the temple there in Jerusalem. Governor Petronius decided not to obey Emperor Caligula. And he sent a letter to Caligula that he would not obey his law and exhorted the emperor to rescind it. Caligula, of course, was ticked off. He sent word to Petronius to kill himself for not obeying. 2 weeks later, in the providence of God, Caligula was assassinated by his Praetorian Guard. And fortunately for Governor Petronius, the ship carrying word for him to kill himself arrived after the ship carrying the news that Caligula had been assassinated. It's a little vignette of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, practiced down through history. But the application of the doctrine fits in any form of government. Now, the doctrine itself is founded in a historic Christian doctrine known as interposition. Interposition is that calling of God which causes one to step into the gap, willingly placing himself between the oppressor and his intended victim. One of the key passages of Scripture is Ezekiel 22, 27 through 31, if you want to mark that down, where interposition is talked about, standing in the gap. We have many examples of interposition. The Hebrew midwives, for example, not killing the male Hebrew children. They interposed on their behalf. Remember, Jonathan didn't hear Saul's foolish command not to eat, ate honey. Saul was going to have his own son killed, and the people interposed and said, Scriptures say, they rescued Jonathan. When it comes to the interposition of the lesser magistrate, he stands between the higher tyrant civil authority and the people. And when it comes to the story of Governor Petronius and Emperor Caligula, it's interesting because the Jews had met with Governor Petronius, exhorting him not to obey the law of the emperor, encouraging him not to do it. He didn't listen to them at first, but he finally decided to listen to them. And when he called them to Tiberias, 30,000 of them, nearly 30,000 of them arrived. And when they came into the arena there, about 12,000 Roman soldiers were standing there. And the last time they had met with him, with Governor Petronius, they had bared their necks before him and said, kill us now, because we cannot allow this to happen to our temple. So they didn't know what was going to happen. And Governor Petronius stood there with the soldiers here and the Jews here, and he declared to them the law of the emperor, and that resistance to it was death. And after reading that, he stepped down and actually stood in between the soldiers and the Jews, demonstrating his interposition, and announced to them that he would send word to the emperor that he would not obey this law, and he would do all that was at his resources to convince the emperor to rescind the law. So the doctrine of interposition is at the root of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. Now, this isn't lawlessness. We should try to forbear when civil authority makes laws or policies that are wrong. We should try to forbear, or we should try to correct them through the means which have been established. But there's 3 times which demand immediate interposition by the lesser authorities. The first is here. They are to oppose and resist any laws or edicts from the higher authority which contravene, oppose, or contradict the law or word of God. Second, they are to protect the person, property, and liberty of those who reside within their jurisdiction from tyrannical attacks by higher authority. And third, since we live in America, they are not to implement any laws, policies, or court opinions made by the higher authority that violate or exceed the U.S. Constitution or their state constitution, and if necessary, resist them. That's when interposition is needed and necessary by the lesser authorities. Now, this is an important point. The rallying cry of Western man for over 1,500 years is that divine law trumps human law. And this is a fact. My libertarian friends love my book except this part. And I try to convince them and tell them this is the most salient part of my book. Throw this away and we're back starting with man. Who decides? God's law was viewed by man, Western man, for nearly 1,500 years as that objective standard by which we judge whether the laws of men are good or bad, just or unjust, moral or immoral. Whether you read the writings of Alfred the Great in the 8th century, or John of Salisbury in the 12th century, or William Blackstone in the 18th century, they all called the law of God the higher law to which all men and all governments of men were accountable. And any law made that was contrary to it was viewed as no law at all. Things weren't perfect because man is what he is. But at least you had a standard that was established and could be rallied to and was over and over again as you read the history of Western civilization. Here's what William Blackstone said. He's the most cited legal scholar by America's founders. He said, upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, talking about God's written law, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these. So when there's a law, or in this case, a mere court opinion, which declares that people can be killed, it should not be suffered amongst us. When there's a mere court opinion, not even a law, which says that 2 men and 2 women can marry, it should not be suffered amongst us. And there's a great other list. That he was talking about the law of God is clear because Blackstone went on to say it, talking about the law of God, is binding over all the globe in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority immediately or immediately from this original. The doctrines thus delivered we call the revealed or divine law. They are found only in the Holy Scriptures. Massive. James Wilson, who was on the very first Supreme Court, appointed by George Washington himself, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, said this: as promulgated by reason in the moral sense, it has been called natural. As promulgated by the Holy Scriptures, it has been called revealed law. As addressed to men, it has been denominated the law of nature. As addressed to political societies, it has been denominated the law of nations. But it should always be remembered that this law, whether natural or revealed, made for men or for nations, flows from the same divine source. It is the law of God. This was the common thinking of Western man for 1,500 years. Divine law trumps human law. He went on to say human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. When an objective standard is thrown off, law is easily and constantly redefined by the state and society. Man's passions and desires begin to determine what is lawful. For this reason, an objective standard of law is always and everywhere necessary, one which does not change and which is applicable to all mankind. Very important. Because we've thrown the law of God under the bus, this is what we're left with now. The state gets to decide what is law. There is no more objective standard. Francis Schaeffer said, if there are no absolutes by which to judge society, then society becomes an absolute. Yep, we're there. They make it up as they go, out of thin air. God's established 4 realms of government, which he delegates authority to: self-government, family government, church government, civil government. Each has its own function, role, and jurisdiction. If one invades the jurisdiction of the other, chaos or tyranny ensues. This is very important to understand. The authority an individual possesses in any one of these 4 realms of government is delegated. It's delegated authority. In other words, they derive their authority from God. Their authority is not autonomous or unconditional. Their authority is God-given, and thus they have a duty to govern in accordance with His rule. This is very important to understand. So in family government, if Dad, the head of the homes, tells Junior to go down and rob the gas station on the corner, because if he gets caught, he's only going to juvenile for a few months, but if Dad gets caught, he'll go to prison for years, everyone understands that Junior has no duty to obey Dad. It's no different with civil government. If they make law contrary to God's law and word, they are not to be obeyed either. They are to be resisted. Understand? Why? Because the authority anyone possesses is not their own. They don't hold it autonomously. It's delegated authority. It's granted to them of God. They're there. They have a duty to govern according to His rule. Very important to understand. How many of you have ever read Polycraticus by John of Salisbury? Okay, all my sons and daughters have to read Polycraticus by John of Salisbury, written in 1159 AD. Phenomenal work, not political theory, how things were viewed politically at that time. Amazing. I used to just write off all the medieval writers as, how could anything good come from them? I've been reading them over the last 5 years, and there are some dopey medieval writers. But there are some great medieval writers too. Phenomenal. And John of Salisbury is one of them. It was amazing how biblical their worldview was and the application they made to everyday life. It's pretty astounding. Here's what John of Salisbury said in Polycraticus. All power or all authority is from the Lord God. In other words, delegated authority. The power which the prince has is therefore from God. Delegated authority from God. For the power of God is never lost nor severed from Him, but He merely exercises it through a subordinate hand. Okay? Here's what John of Salisbury said about the lesser magistrates. He said, loyal shoulders should sustain the power of the ruler so long as it is exercised in subjection to God and follows His ordinances. But if it resists and opposes the divine commandments and wishes to make me share in its war against God, then with unrestrained voice I answer back that God must be preferred before any man on earth. Amen? This was the common thinking of Western man, and it's appealed to over and over again when you read the history of Western civilization. The role of the people is huge to the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. Often the lesser magistrates won't do what is needed and necessary. They have to be prodded to do what's needed and necessary. And then they have to be assured of our full support if they do what's needed and necessary, of our very persons, of our very lives, of our prayers, of our finances. Here's what Publius Petronius said the first time the Jews came to him and asked him not to obey the law of the emperor. He said, if indeed I myself were emperor and were at liberty to follow my own inclination, then a design to act thus, these your words would be justly spoken to me. But now Caesar has sent to me, I am under the necessity of being subservient to his decrees, because a disobedience to them will bring inevitable destruction. In other words, I want to live, is what he's saying. But here's what he said after the people who didn't go away. They didn't write one letter and then go home. Oh, well, that didn't work. They actually neglected their fields. They followed him when he left from one city to another. Men, women, and children, tens of thousands, remonstrating before him, demonstrating before him, don't do this. This is immoral. It's wrong. Don't obey this law of the emperor. The role of the people is massive when it comes to the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. Here's what he ends up saying in part. And may God be your assistant, after he lets him know he isn't going to obey the law of the emperor. And may God be your assistant, for his authority is beyond all the contrivance and power of men. And may he procure you the preservation of your ancient laws, and may not he be deprived, though without your consent, of his accustomed honors. But if Caligula be irritated and turn the violence of his rage upon me, I will rather undergo all the danger and affliction that may come either on my body or my soul than see so many of you perish while you're acting so excellent a manner. Therefore, every one of you go your way about your own occupations, follow the cultivation of your ground. I will myself send to Rome and will not refuse to serve you in all things, both by myself and by my friends. Okay? The role of the people in the doctrine of lesser magistrates is massively important. It forces you to build relationship with your state, county, and local officials. That's good. What happens if we all decide we ain't going to take it anymore and show up on the corner with shotguns? I'll tell you what'll happen. The federal government will take care of that in no time flat. I've read extensively about peasant wars, and it usually, almost never, does it go good for the peasants. Never. See, the higher-ranking civil authority, when it's acting tyrannically, counts on the compliance of the lesser authorities to make sure that the tentacles of their tyranny get into every fabric of society. It's when they lose that compliance that they know they have a problem on their hands. That's why we need to rally our lesser magistrates to do what's needed and necessary. In this case, against federal tyranny. Here's what Frederick Douglass, great abolitionist, said. He said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those who they oppress." That's why I keep using this term that there must be a demand. And they must be offered nothing less. There's some things where you can offer less. There's situations where you can't. Here's what James Madison said just 11 years after the ink had dried on the U.S. Constitution. Remember who James Madison is? The architect of the U.S. Constitution, the father of the U.S. Constitution. Big Federalist, with the whole Federalist, anti-Federalist debate. Just 11 years after the ink had dried, the federal government had already begun to act outside their constitutional restraints. And James Madison himself wrote the Virginia Resolutions because Virginia and Kentucky resisted the federal government over the Alien and Sedition Acts. Here's what he wrote in part. He said, "The states who are parties thereto, parties to the U.S. Constitution, have the right and are in duty bound to interposition, for arresting the progress of evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them." In other words, our founding fathers never expected the states to just go along with federal tyranny, ever. They expected the states to interpose. They expected them to resist. And they wrote about this extensively. Thomas Jefferson penned the Kentucky Resolution, and he said, "In that whensoever the general government," talking about the federal government, "assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force." Here's what James Madison said in Federalist number 45. He said, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution of the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." Do you think we're still in that position? Something else Madison wrote in regards to the belief that there should be resistance. Up in Milwaukee, where I'm from, there's a great story about this runaway slave, Joshua Glover. Joshua Glover was arrested in Racine, Wisconsin under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. He was a runaway slave taken up to Milwaukee. The year's 1854. Word spreads that he's being brought up there, and this gentleman, Sherman Booth, who's a newspaper publisher, makes a flyer out of jail. He spends the next 2 weeks on the Underground Railroad, makes it to a ship, and leaves the port of Racine, goes to Canada, and dies of old age 26 years later. Well, the feds were all ticked off because, oh man, the slave got away. So they wanted to get somebody. There weren't video cameras back then, so they went after Sherman Booth, and they charged him under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. And our government in Wisconsin interposed on his behalf and kept him from being seized by the feds for 4 years. And both our state legislature and our state Supreme Court defied the federal government and defied the Supreme Court itself regarding the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. It's still memorialized to this day around Milwaukee on overpass murals, plaques. Here's what they said in part: resolved that this assumption of jurisdiction by the federal judiciary in the said case and without process is an act of undelegated power and therefore without authority, void, and of no force. Doesn't that sound strikingly familiar to 60 years earlier with the Virginia Resolution? This was the understanding that resistance should be made, that states had a duty to interpose against federal tyranny. This is just one story. There's many more acts of interposition by states prior to the Civil War. If those who administer, this is what Thomas Jefferson said, administer the general government, the federal government, be permitted to transgress the limits fixed by the compact, the U.S. Constitution, by a total disregard to the special delegations of power therein contained, annihilation of the state governments and the erection upon their ruins of a general consolidation government will be the inevitable consequence. We have long been there. The states have been reduced to mere provinces of this federal government, as nothing more than implementation centers of immoral, unjust federal law, policy, and court opinion. That's what they've become, and they were never supposed to be that. Here's something that I wrote. I know you're not supposed to put up what you put on Facebook as a speaker, but I did. Here's what I wrote on Facebook right after, the day after the Obergefell homosexual marriage opinion came out. I said, so I've gotten about 20 emails from pro-family and Christian groups, all declaring homosexual marriage to now be the law of the land. And each one of them asked for money so they can fight against it. Wow. Roe v. Wade all over again. Calls for a federal constitutional amendment again. This is all a fiction. The reality, first, the Supreme Court cannot make law. That takes legislators. Second, when one branch of government violates the Constitution, including the Supreme Court, all other areas of government, federal, state, county, and local, have the duty more than ever to uphold the Constitution and defy that branch of government. This is true federalism. Amen? That's right. Here's our governor who just pulled out of the presidential race. Here's what he said after Obergefell was ruled on. He couldn't run to a microphone fast enough and condemn it. And then, of course, he said, as a result of this decision, the only alternative left for the American people is to support an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to reaffirm the ability of the states to continue to define marriage. There's a bridge to nowhere. There's the political hamster wheel that takes good people and keeps them busy doing nothing with the rest of their life. Because what he's saying is a lie. It isn't the only alternative. He should interpose as the governor of our state and defy the federal government and not act like this is the law of the land, because the Supreme Court cannot make law. Article 1, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution declares that all legislative powers reside within Congress. You know how much legislative power that leaves for the Supreme Court? Zero. So he's lying to people. The truth of the matter is the GOP's found this good. They love these federal courts, and they love to hide behind the lie of, oh, a federal court has ruled, so I must obey. Because then they can act like to their constituents, well, I'm against that great evil, but a federal court's ruled. They get to have it both ways. Let me tell you what Scott Walker really thought about this matter. Here's what he said last October. Here's what he said last October when a federal court trampled our state constitution. Rather than telling what federal court where to go and defending our state constitution, here's what he said. He couldn't run fast enough to a microphone that day either. He said, for us, it's over in Wisconsin. The federal courts have ruled that this decision by this Court of Appeals decision is the law of the land, and we will be upholding it. That's what he said. See, they love this lie. It's the lie of the lesser magistrates to hide behind this idea that they have to obey the federal judiciary, which is a lie. You know what they base that on? The Supremacy Clause. If you go to the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Paragraph 2 of our U.S. Constitution, actually read it, they say the Supremacy Clause makes the Supreme Court the final arbiter of all law in our nation. It is a lie. When you go to the Supremacy Clause, the Supreme Court isn't even mentioned in it, nor are the federal courts even mentioned in it. You know what has supremacy? The Constitution itself, and all laws made in accordance therewith. It's constitutional supremacy, not judicial supremacy, that rules. It's a lie that people have bought into. Here's what he went on to say when he was questioned by the press that day in October last year. He said, "I'd rather be talking in the future now, more about our jobs plan and our plan for the future of the state. I think that's what matters to the kids, not this issue." That's what Scott Walker really thinks about homosexual marriage. And that's why he loved it when the Supreme Court and all these other GOP governors just loved it. Have you seen one of them stand in defiance? Not one. They proliferate the lie, and the pro-life, pro-family groups help them proliferate the lie that it's the law of the land. It is not. It's a lie. And it was never intended by our founders, and it's not in the Constitution. There's a tyrant on the loose. It's called the federal judiciary. You know, Rasmussen did a poll just this past July where they found that 33% of Americans now believe it's time for the states to openly defy the federal judiciary. That was a 9% increase from their polling just 4 months earlier. Do you know how massively huge that is? 33%? That's massive. Thomas Jefferson, here's what I hear from, my leftist friends, all the time. Well, this was all decided back in Marbury versus Madison, and everybody's been okay with it all this time. Why should you think it's a problem? Okay, thank you for letting me know how ignorant of history you are. The truth of the matter is, men have been writing against this for 200 years. This lie that the pro-life, pro-family groups just glibly throw around and help affirm. You seem to consider, here's what Thomas Jefferson said in a letter to William Jefferson, you seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. Thomas Jefferson wrote volumes on this matter. Here's what he said in 1821, a year later, in another letter to another guy. The germ of dissolution of our federal government is in the Constitution of the federal judiciary. An irresponsible body for impeachment is scarcely a scarecrow. Yeah, good luck impeaching any of them. Working like gravity by night and by day, gaining a little today and a little tomorrow, and advancing its noiseless step like a thief over the field of jurisdiction until all shall be usurped. He understood where this was going way back then. And he and many other great men have wrote about it for the last 200 years. Here's what he said 2 years later. At the establishment of our constitutions, the judiciary bodies were supposed to be the most helpless and harmless members of the government. Just read Federalist 78. They were supposed to be that. Experience, however, soon showed in what way they were to become the most dangerous. That the insufficiency of the means provided for the removal gave them a freehold and irresponsibility in office. That their decisions, seeming to concern individual suitors only, passed silent and unheeded by the public at large. That these decisions nevertheless become law by precedent, sapping by little and little the foundations of the Constitution and working its change by construction before anyone has perceived that invisible and helpless worm has been busily employed in the consuming its substance. Is that phenomenal? That's phenomenal stuff. Here's what Abraham Lincoln said. The candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, in ordinary litigation between parties and personal actions, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government in the hands of that eminent tribunal. That's what we have done. Men have been writing about this for 200 years, depending on how outrageous immoral and despicable, the Supreme Court happens to be happening at the time. True federalism understands that all magistrates, whatever their level or sphere of jurisdiction, possess lawful authority. That's what you have to understand. And that whenever one branch of government begins to play the tyrant, all other branches, whether federal, state, county, or local, have the duty then more than ever to uphold the Constitution, oppose that branch acting tyrannically, even if that branch is the Supreme Court. This is why our founders put branches of government. They knew that the nature of man was such that too much power in one hand or group of hands is bad. And yet we've ceded everything to the federal government and to the federal judiciary. The Bible says when you sit down to eat with the ruler, consider carefully what is before you and put a knife to your throat if you're a man given to appetite. Do you know why the Bible tells us to put a knife to our throat when we meet with the ruler, the magistrate? Because we need to put a knife to our throat when we sit down and talk to them. Because they'll try to convince you and cajole you into seeing why they can only do less than what is needed and necessary. How many of you know who this guy is? Sheriff Nick Finch out of Liberty County, Florida. 2 years ago, Nick Finch had a deputy arrest a guy in his county on a gun charge. When he came to work that evening, he saw the guy was in his county jail, saw what he was charged with, said that's a law which is an infringement upon the Second Amendment right. He actually went down, let the man out himself, and let him walk free. 3 months later, agents from the governor's office and the attorney general's office, along with the district attorney of the county, came and arrested Sheriff Finch and charged him with 3 counts of malfeasance in office. You know what the people did? They rallied to their sheriff. They held public demonstrations, not one, many. They did signature gathering. And their message was simple. Why are you attacking our sheriff when he's simply defending our liberties? His trial was held in October of that year. It was a 3-day trial. And when it was over with, the jury was out for less than an hour. And when they came back, they found him not guilty of all 3 counts. 3 hours later, the governor reinstated him to his office as sheriff. That is the doctrine of the lesser magistrate practiced in front of your eyes. This guy's a strong man. He wept when he was real. You got to understand, they took away everything, how he put food on his table for his family. He was looking at years in prison. He wept when he was exonerated. Just 4 weeks ago, there was an elderly military veteran in Idaho who the federal government was going to come and take his guns because they said he was financially incompetent to own them. This is something the federal government has been doing more of around the country. Financially incompetent to own them. In June, I did a Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate presentation. A state representative attended. That state representative, another state representative, and the county sheriff, and 85 people all showed up outside this guy's home. You can Google it. It's a huge story out in Idaho. And they said, you're not taking his guns. They stood in interposition. The feds finally sent out some lackey 4 hours later who simply walked up and said, okay, we won't take his guns today, and walked away. And then they got it worked out afterwards, so the man is able to keep his weapons. This doctrine is vital. This doctrine is important. This is another lesser magistrate. This woman was a county commissioner out in Maryland, told she couldn't pray before the meeting by a federal judge. So the next week, when they had their meeting, she prayed anyways. And she was one smart cookie the way she did it. She actually prayed a prayer by George Washington that he had prayed at a government gathering 200 and some years earlier. So they didn't know what to do. The prayer was awesome. Jesus was mentioned. The Holy Spirit was mentioned. This is Judge Roy Moore. The entire Alabama Supreme Court stood in defiance. A federal judge actually started homosexual marriage in their state. They stood in interposition and stopped it cold until the Supreme Court ruling came down. Everybody's still waiting. It's still in play to see what they're going to do next. Most of the probate judges, that's who issue licenses, are giving them to homosexual couples, but there's still about a dozen that aren't. That's our website, lessermagistrate.com, where you can learn more. And that's also our website, Defy Tyrants. For some reason, I didn't have certain parts of my thing here. Let me tell you this. There's been a lot of press about Kim Davis and the clerks out in Kentucky. And I want to talk about that real briefly. Do I have time for that? Okay. First off, thank God that somebody's doing something because most everybody's doing nothing, you know. So I honor them for the stand that they've taken. But the stand they've taken is clearly flawed. Religious liberty is not the ground to stand on. She's not just an individual citizen. She's a magistrate, and as such, she possesses lawful authority. Her duties far beyond merely, oh, it comes in against my religious liberties. By the way, we've already learned that the religious liberty issue is a loser. How many bakers, how many photographers have to lose before we figure that out, that we have a lawless federal judiciary that when it comes to the homosexual juggernaut doesn't care about anyone's religious liberties. They want to impose this filth upon everyone. So Kim Davis is saying, I don't want to sign the thing, but at the same time, her and Casey Davis, the other clerk, are saying, what we need over here, Governor Beshears, is a 121st county clerk. There's 120 in Kentucky right now. And that county clerk, which would probably be a computer in the state capitol in Frankfort, Kentucky, could issue marriage licenses to both homosexuals and heterosexual couples. By the way, she's not issuing licenses to heterosexuals either because of her flawed stand on religious liberty. Her lawyers told her, you don't want it to look like you're discriminating against homosexuals. So get this. Right now, there is no law anywhere in Kentucky for 2 men or 2 women to get married. There's no federal law anywhere in this country for 2 men or 2 women to get married. There's a mere court opinion. That's it. She's the one actually upholding the law by not issuing them to homosexuals. But she's breaking the law because she should be issuing them to heterosexuals. Understand? But what she's doing is this. She's taking herself and saying, I don't want to be a part of the process. So Governor Beshears, make this 121st county clerk. But then she's saying, and so what she's saying is, I don't want to be a part of the process, but you need to create a process so that wickedness can continue. That's not true in her position. And we've tried to explain that to these clerks, that this is messed up, that they'll actually create the first law in Kentucky that recognizes homosexual marriage. Because the GOP, get this, the GOP views this as a winner to unseat the Democratic Governor Beshears and the Democratic Attorney General Jack Conway. Oh, this poor woman sitting in jail because of federal tyranny over religious liberty because Beshears won't call a special session and create this 121st. When the GOP is done and unseats Beshears and Conway, they'll make the first law to recognize homosexual marriage in Kentucky. That's how crazy it is. That's how bad it is. So, they're going to do everything they can to promote this religious liberty idea because it's their new retreat point. This is what conservatives have done for a long time. They start here and they keep retreating. Just in my short time when it comes to the homosexual issue, I remember when the conservatives were all against homosexuality. Then they accommodated themselves to that, and the new retreat point became homosexual marriage. Oh, we're going to fight against that. Now they're all accommodating themselves to homosexual marriage, and the new retreat point is religious liberty. Do you know what these laws do? I've been against these laws for decades, where some sort of wickedness comes in, but we'll let the pastor, which I'm one, and we'll let the Christian churches not have to be a part of that, or Christian organizations. You know what that does? It further marginalizes Christ and Christianity out of the culture. That's what it does. We should oppose all those laws. There was other stuff I had to talk about. But anyways, I have a bunch of free stuff out there. Everything's free on the table except the books. The Magdeburg Confession, my book, $10 a piece. The sermons, the literature, some sober and needful thoughts in the defiance of clerks in Kentucky. Very important article. Everything out there is free except the books, and I hope you avail yourselves to them and learn about this doctrine. I'll tell you, I've been astounded. Can ask my beautiful wife here. When this whole thing was going on, I don't know how many interviews I did. It was day and night for 6 days. I spent 2 days in my room in my underwear doing radio interview after radio interview. No TV, don't worry. I couldn't even get out of my room for the day. Many of these were secular stations where they wanted me on for 8 to 10 minutes and they'd have me on for 40 to 45. They had such interest in this. They were astounded, and their listeners had such interest. As much as those who have the interest in upholding the status quo as it is now and has been for decades, this doctrine is exploding because it resonates with people. People know this is insanity where we're at in this nation. And when they hear about the doctrine, they see its goodness. They see that it's found in Scripture and that it's been proven in history, employed by men down through history, proven successful time and time again, to often rein in the tyranny of the higher civil authority, and often, more often than not, bloodlessly rein it in. And I believe that's why it's exploding. My book is a little self-published book. It's been selling hundreds of copies. It's all word of mouth. I have 11 children. I pastor a church, head up a pro-life mission. I got no time for self-promotion. This thing has taken on a life of its own. I'm being flown all over the country to do lectures. I'm doing radio interviews, all word of mouth. This month, thousands of copies have sold now. Just this month. It's been hundreds every month this year, because it resonates with people, because people are tired of thinking all we can do is wring our hands and be led by that horse and pony show called the next presidential election campaign. And then the whole cycle starts over again, and nothing really changes. I've lived long enough to realize I don't care if it's the Democrats or the Republicans in office, the country keeps going in the same direction. Government, the federal government keeps more invasive, more bureaucratic, bigger. Doesn't matter. This will defeat tyranny. The doctrine of the lesser magistrate will defeat tyranny. So I pray that you give it a fair hearing. Thank you. Okay, so did any things get turned in?
So it's like right now, John, I'm going to have John ask the first question or two.
You're going to, you want me to do it now?
Sure.
Okay. First of all, my first question after your lecture is how do we get Petronius to run for president? So I guess I am going to riff off that question. Around the country, and you've mentioned a number of recent times, even if it was imperfect with Kim Davis, you've mentioned a number of recent times where the doctrine has actually been expressed by lesser magistrates. If I asked this room to write down the 5 best governors in the country, Scott Walker would probably be in that top 5. Out of those top 5, can you think of anyone that would be willing to do this in front of the federal government? Bobby Jindal, anyone?
Sure.
Do you know who would say, no, you've gone too far? Or are we just looking on the level of clerks and judges and that kind of thing? Sure.
Right. Well, they have to be prodded. There is no one at this time that I know of in the governorship that would do it. They have to be prodded. And one thing I want to point out here, isn't it interesting how selective our federal government is when it comes to responding to states asserting their sovereignty? For instance, many states have legalized the use of marijuana. Other states have created these sanctuary cities. There actually are federal laws against both of those, and yet we see no federal response whatsoever to either of those, do we? Yet, where there is no federal law, 2 men or 2 women can marry, here we see a federal judge throw a woman in jail. Showing what is their holy grail, if you understand what I mean. So the governors have to be prodded, and sometimes things work in reverse. There could be a lowly county clerk or probate judge who is mistreated, who stands in interposition, which could cause a legislature or a governor or an attorney general to interpose and finally defy the federal government over this very matter. There's actually a probate judge in Oregon, but he's foolishly standing on religious liberty. There's another one in Wyoming, foolishly standing on religious liberty. But in Texas and Alabama, we have county clerks in Texas, probate judges in Alabama that are standing in true interposition, at least so far, who we've been in constant contact with and have many things to help them be supported and to get the people taught and trained to understand the importance of this doctrine so they rally to these magistrates and just don't leave them hanging out in the wind while they're there. Just last week, a bill was introduced in the Tennessee legislature. They don't come back into session until January. It is interposition. They are just declaring Obergefell, homosexual marriage opinion, to be null, and they use those words, null, void, and of no force. Unrecognized, they will penalize in their bill any state official who tries to accommodate homosexual marriage in their bill. To me, they didn't even need to write a bill. They could have merely wrote a resolution in that regard and accomplished pretty much everything that they're trying to do through the bill. But whatever. So we know it's going to sail through the House easily. We know there's going to be a fight in the Senate. And we know the governor has already decided what he's going to do is lay down to the feds. But he can be prodded. That's where the people come in. He has to be prodded both publicly with large gatherings and privately with men of renown and position to convince him to do what's needed and necessary. What's good about this action by Tennessee, though, is this. It's something we're now able to present to people in every state to take to their legislators and say, why isn't this happening in our state? This is good. It needs to happen here. Maybe not Illinois, but Wisconsin, there's 31 states with constitutional amendments against homosexual marriage, which won overwhelmingly amongst the electorate. And that should not, and you know why they told us to get these constitutional amendments? They said because there might be an activist federal judge who would try to trample our state laws. So if we put this constitutional amendment in place, then we'll protect ourselves from and as soon as they trample our Constitution, they all lay down and say, oh, that's the law of the land now. And we got to obey. There's nothing left we can do. Shucks. Could you give me some money? Because we're going to start trying to get a constitutional amendment. The bridge to nowhere. It's a laughing stock. That's my wife. I cry about this stuff. It kills me. I've been involved in trying to defend the preborn. I've done 1.5 years in jail for interposing at the doors of death camps when I was younger. This is important to me, this stuff. And to see how people use things of such direness. Do you know the corrupting influence of homosexual marriage and homosexuality upon our sons and daughters? How massive that is? How it feeds down into every fabric of society? I'm a student of history. I know exactly where this story ends. And it's awful. It's awful. So it's incumbent upon us to act and to even seem radical or strident or extremist. But we're not. We're upholding the Constitution. Not only do we understand the importance of divine law, but in this case we have the Constitution on our side too, regarding this matter of the slaughter of the preborn and the imposition of homosexual marriage.
Okay, these are all good questions. First one, what are you suggesting that Christians like Kim Davis do? That is, what should she stand on if it's not based on religious liberty? I think the question is conscience or interposition. Can you?
Yes. It's interposition. She possesses lawful authority as a civil magistrate. She's not just a private individual. She needs to interpose. So she needs to continue to issue the licenses to heterosexual couples as the law states there in Kentucky. And she needs to not issue them to homosexual couples as the law and Constitution states there in Kentucky. She should also rally, if possible, which she doesn't have, by the way, her district attorney and her sheriff to her side. And this is, when you're starting at a county level, that's pretty low on the totem pole. So you want as many people who have authority in your county to be with you in your stand. But this, too, plays an important role in getting a governor or an attorney general or a legislature.
Homosexual men away. If you are Kim Davis and I came up and I asked for it, what would you say? I would cite to them the laws of Kentucky and the Constitution of Kentucky. And I would point out that there's no law in Kentucky that gives them the right to marry, nor is there any federal law which gives them the right to marry. And this idea that the opinion of the Supreme Court is the law of the land is an utter fiction that was created by the Supreme Court itself. They had a follow-up question, and it's this. Wouldn't lesser magistrates get eliminated by the tyrannical government? Isn't the real and long-standing answer, we the people? Aren't we the problem and the solution, not the lesser magistrates?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the lesser magistrates interposing, Suetonius wrote about this. He said when the lesser magistrate does that, he grabs the wolf by the ears. In other words, you better consider what he's doing, because the tyrant is going to bite. There will be a conflict. There always is. So you want to be well thought out in what you are doing and the actions that you're taking. But again, this goes back to, yes, we the people are massively important to the doctrine, because the people stand with the magistrate who's interposing. That last rally before the federal judge let her out, 10,000 people were there. The press don't tell you that. 10,000 people. I was in that city, Grayson, that hamlet, okay? unbelievable that 10,000 people would put off stuff in the middle of their day to go there. So they rally, and people want to rally. They're looking for magistrates who they can rally around. This clerk who's defying, she actually issued a declaration of interposition down in Erie County, Texas. She said people everywhere she goes are asking her, what can I do to help? What can I do to help? And who knows, her stand may end up influencing the governor and the attorney general at some point to take a stand in defiance of federal judicial lawlessness.
Before I move on to the next question, Pastor, I think there might be a little confusion.
Okay.
Can you just give us a brief difference between interposition and conscience, or at least between Kim Davis and the Sweet Cakes by Melissa?
Oh, yeah.
What's the difference in their position?
Well, the difference is Sweet Cakes, you know, is a private citizen. Kim Davis is a magistrate possessing lawful authority. So they're standing on their conscience and their religious liberties, Sweet Cakes is. When it comes to Kim Davis, her duty is far bigger than her little personal religious feelings. This is a matter of law. This is a matter of the U.S. Constitution, which she took an oath to uphold. Every magistrate, regardless of what level they are, every magistrate in this country takes an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution. They do not take an oath of subservience to the federal government. That's the lie that's been propagated. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution, so whenever one branch begins to play the tyrant, every other branch, whether federal, state, county, or local, has the duty to defy and resist the branch that's decided to play the tyrant. So that's the difference between the two.
Okay. This one, your feckless assumptions and blanket condemnation of pro-life, pro-family GOP was over the top and deeply offensive. Where's the Christian grace for those who are or may be misinformed and ignorant of this doctrine?
Yeah.
Not lying.
I'm from the east side of Detroit, okay? So I just cut to the chase. I've been involved in this fight for many years. There were things that I held to that are absurd, that I view as absurd now. One of the things that happens is sometimes my east side Detroiterism can be abrasive to people. And amazingly, I've toned it down a lot over the years. But, so it was much more so in the past. But my hope is this, is that by being abrasive, if I am that way to some and that type of thing, that it'll at least get people to wake up and consider these things, to think, wow, what in the world? And we need to do something here. And I just want you to know this. What motivates me regarding to my Christian love is my love for him and my love for my neighbor. And that's why I get emotional. I get fiery about it, is because I see what happens to them. I've buried these preborn babies. I know what they look like after they've been in the hands of the abortionist. That's right. And so I can't, to me, this is massive. I can't believe there hasn't been one governor, not one legislature, not one mayor, not one common council in 40 plus years that has told the federal government, we don't care about your opinion. You're not murdering children here in our jurisdiction. That leaves me flabbergasted. It's murder. It's not just, abortion isn't just a bad thing. It is murder. It is brutal killing. So that's what motivates me. So, but I do apologize if I come across that way. It's just...
Let me challenge you on that point.
Sure.
Okay. We're both pastors.
Yep.
And if I asked you to name 25 pastors who know the doctrine of lesser magistrates, you might struggle. You might a few more, but not a lot of pastors know this doctrine.
Yes.
Certainly not. It's not being taught in the public schools. Certainly not taught in the seminaries. I don't know how many lesser magistrates know about the doctrine of lesser magistrates. So, so the question is, how do you grow that? How do you grow that? And would that with that understanding, with the ignorance of it, I have a feeling that many of these people in this room today are hearing it for the first time.
Okay.
And so, is it negligence or ignorance, or is it? I know you think with some of the leadership, it's not that they know better. And so, where do you draw the line there between the ignorance and actually nefarious? Oh, this is a cop out. I'm free now.
Sure. Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
In fact, about 5 years ago, I went to a big gathering out in Washington, D.C. It was all pastors, about 120 pastors. They bring in senators and congressmen who would talk, and then you had time for Q&A. And being all Christians, we all preferred others before ourselves, and nobody wanted to ask a question. So finally, I'd put my arm up, and I asked them the same question every time. And amazingly enough, I was the only one to ever ask a question. But I'd ask them, have you ever heard of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate? And if you have, could you tell us what it is? None of them had heard about it until Todd Akin, Congressman from Missouri. I asked him, and he stood up there for like 15 minutes, probably expounded the doctrine better than I could ever dream of expounding the doctrine. And when the timing was done, because you only ask a question, you don't get to give the answer. So by the time he was done explaining it, I was watching around the room, and you saw these pastors marking this down on their pad of paper. So yeah, I think ignorance is massive. One of the things that's going to help it to grow is the federal government itself. We can count on them continue to act wickedly. They ain't going to start acting better or nicer. They're going to continue to foment their tyranny upon the nation. They've already discredited themselves with many Americans. They've long discredited themselves with me. And they're adding to their discreditation daily with Americans. And so that's totally playing in our favor. And so when people want to resist or see the need to resist, they're good people. They want to make sure that what they're doing is legitimate, that it's proper. And that's what they see within the doctrine. It isn't chaos, it isn't lawlessness, it has order to it. And, you know, some people say, well, if everybody just gets to do what they want, it'd be chaos and that type of thing. No. Did you see the 3 things I listed? When you don't get to just not go along because it doesn't tickle your fancy. Okay? It's just when those 3 things happen, the lesser magistrates should not go along. So people used to accuse us when we blockade the doors of the abortion clinic of being anarchists. And I would always point out to them, the Supreme Court's the anarchist. They declared anarchy when they declared innocent preborn babies open game to those who kill for profit. We're the ones restoring order. And it's the same with the lesser magistrate. When the higher civil authority acts tyrannically and imposes its tyranny and lawlessness upon the nation, the magistrates who don't go along with the rebellion against God and obey God rather than man, they're the ones actually restoring order. It's the Supreme Court that's the anarchist.
2 questions left. What are the people to do when they don't have the wisdom of Petronius with their lesser magistrates?
Okay.
You laughed about Illinois, but that's pretty much Illinois.
Right.
We don't.
That's what I came to understand from talking with you.
Would you suggest, and I'm adding to this question, would you suggest something about what Brandeis brought up about the states being 50 laboratories of democracy? Would you say vote with your feet?
Well, you could move, yes. You could move to a different place. That's an option. If it's that bad where you're at.
It is. Yeah.
It is. So, and by the way, have you noticed there has been, demographers have been pointing out this flight to the southern states that's been going on for a long time, precisely because the northern states tend to be more involved in every inch of our lives. You know, so.
Another answer might be run to be a lesser magistrate?
You could do that. Okay. You know, the other thing, right, if you can rally people, you know, to take a stand, that type of thing. But yeah, sometimes you just have to be in a place where you endure and you remain faithful to Christ and be that influence there. And, you know, so you don't necessarily need to leave and go to another spot.
I know our Illinois family Vincent, who is trying to rally people of this kind of mindset to become precinct captains and start from the ground up. So,
Okay,
yeah,
excellent.
that'd be it. This is a lesser magistrate, and it's a comment.
Okay.
So I guess you're going to comment on the comment.
Okay.
Speaking as a lesser magistrate, I affirm the need for people to rally behind us when we take a stand. It is a lonely place to take the flag up the hill and find no one or a few behind you.
Yes, and I'll tell you, I don't know who said that, but that is what I hear from everybody who's in political office and wants to do right. How they're left alone, by themselves. When I go to meet with them, because I do that regularly for the last 2 years, to establish a relationship in my county and the neighboring counties and officials, they'll sit there for hours talking to me because they're just so glad to have somebody who came to talk to them to encourage them. So this is like massively important. And some people think, well, I know so-and-so already went and talked to the sheriff. So what? You go talk to him too. He needs to see scores of people, hundreds of people coming and talking to him, assuring him of what he does, if he does what's needed, necessary, and right, that you'll stand with them. It makes a huge difference to them. Often wickedness is able to accelerate because good people think, well, we elected these guys to office and they better do what's needed. And exactly. But they need your assurance too, because they're people. And usually, and I know it's this way at least here in Illinois from what I've learned, they may be one of a very few that's going to do what's needed and necessary. So they, more than anybody, needs people to rally around them and assure them and encourage them in their stand. And this is good, that we build relationships this way between us and our magistrates. And it's an important part of the whole process of how the doctrine works.
One question, but two parts, because I'm a pastor. First of all, the PowerPoint that you had, I know there's probably a lot of people who couldn't get down all those quotes, but they'd love to have them. Is there something on the table out there you're selling, or a place they can go to get the PowerPoint that you shared?
Yeah, well, I think this was recorded.
Okay.
And so I think Calvin would be able to let everybody know, but I don't have it on a piece of paper, no,
Okay,
to answer your question.
livestream.com, that's true. I'll let Calvin comment on that. Final question was about judges. Are you in favor, Ted Cruz recently came out saying about Supreme Court judges that he'd be willing to waive their terms. Are you in favor of term limits for federal judges?
I don't think that's the remedy, and that's the one thing I don't, well, I'm not even going to get into that, but yeah, what I'm in favor of is interposition, because what I've seen over and over again is everybody wants to write a new piece of paper, which will then be trampled by another federal judge. And then we'll write another piece of paper, and it'll be trampled by, and that's, we're done with that. We need interposition now. And the only one I've seen talking about defying the federal judiciary as far as the presidential candidates go is Mike Huckabee. He's the only one who said anything in regards to the Supreme Court, in regards to the federal government in opposition to what they've done. I'm just not big on federal politics because, yeah, I've been around for a long time. But I'll tell you, this is very important for you to understand as Christian people. I've been to a lot of state houses around the country dealing with politics for a long time. Here's something I get even from our enemies, not to mention those who are supposed to be our friends. Here's a very, to put it in very generic language, and it's been said this to me this brashly numerous times. You Christians are the biggest laughing stock in this state house. You're always the first to roll over, and you'll do it for the smallest crumb we throw you. I've heard that over and over and over again. And it needs to end. These preborn babies are counting on us. Our sons and daughters are counting on us. And we have to demand what's needed and necessary in regards to the actions of lesser magistrates.
You can tell they fear the gay lobby more than they fear Christians. Now, I have to get this one extra question in because this guy's from the Constitution Party and he's going to think I'm trying to ice him out if I don't read this. It's a good question, actually. Nullification. Is nullification based on the doctrine of the lesser magistrates?
Yeah, I'm so glad somebody brought that up. Somebody's thinking. Okay, yes, it is. In fact, when you read the writings of the doctrine of lesser magistrate during the time of the Reformation, it was so pure, their fealty to Christ, and it was so Christian. And, you know, it's been practiced down through the ages. You know, Runnymede, you know, King John and the nobles of England, they were the lesser magistrates of their day. The Magna Carta, which we hold in esteem, that was a document produced by Christian men, you know, and that was the lesser magistrate doctrine in action. It was precisely because of the lesser magistrates demanding he sign the Magna Carta that he did. And he knew they were willing to use their swords to back it up, too. So that's very important. What was the question again? I'm 55 and I just lost my train of thought. Okay, good. Nullification. So when you read from where the doctrine of lesser magistrate was formalized in other Christian men like Knox and Beza and what's his name? A couple other really important names that I forget right now. They furthered the doctrine. They wrote on the doctrine. You'll notice that as time went on, there was like a wringing of the doctrine to remove its Christianity, to come up with just a kind of secular document that still held to the principles of the doctrine without having Christ and Christianity as the focal point. That's what became known as nullification. And nullification is interposition, where the states interpose against federal tyranny. So, yeah, the nullification came out of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate when you follow it through. It totally was rooted in the doctrine of the lesser magistrate.